Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. I think most of you got your cameras switched off, or you're just in the process of unmuting yourself or muting yourself. Lovely that you can join me this afternoon. This is, obviously you will know, I'm Andrea Collins. This is the second in a series of, how many have we got? 12 webinars that we're doing on behalf of the East Midlands Growth Hub Cluster. And this one is all about manufacturing. So I'd love to say that I have scrutinized attendees today and understand where you're all coming from, but I honestly haven't had time. So some of you may be in manufacturing, some of you may be supporting manufacturing companies, and hence that's the reason that you've come along to today's session. Whichever that is, then welcome. If you'd like to use the chat function to introduce yourselves, that's absolutely fine, so that everybody knows who everybody is. I'm going to move through some slides, but then I really want to leave it open to dialogue at the end. So ask you all if you have any questions and so on, and we can have a general kind of chit chat. I'm going to keep an eye on the waiting room and let people in as and when they join. But yeah, let's just crack on. There's quite a lot to cover. So again, we're talking about manufacturing. I've pulled together an agenda which is broadly based on our understanding of the current state of play. So not just, available research, but also hearing firsthand from our clients that are in that sector. And then I thought it would be interesting to look at manufacturing and the challenges that the sector is facing through a global lens. So for companies that may be importing or exporting, but maybe aren't aware of some things that can ease the challenges or ease their pain at the moment. But similarly, companies that may be experiencing challenges in their sector, but haven't considered global trade as a mechanism to overcome some of those challenges. So we're going to look at downward pressure on prices, which I think most sectors are facing. It's not exclusive to manufacturing. Another one that runs across most sectors is labour and talent, and the shortage that we have in general in the UK. The kind of decreased availability of lending as lenders are becoming more and more risk averse. We'll talk about sustainability, ESG, because that is again something that is increasingly impacting sectors, not just manufacturing. So looking at it from a supply chain perspective, but also from a legislation perspective. We're going to start seeing even more regulation come down as a result of, the very real requirement to protect our environment, and then, of course, also our society. We're looking at increasing costs, and that's kind of linked to currency volatility as well. We'll cover EU trading barriers, because despite what we might like to think, Brexit hasn't gone away, and it's still causing an element of pain and is causing our economy to contract somewhat. And then another thing which we hear from clients, not just in manufacturing but generally, is the problem that they're having obtaining investment for growth. As lenders are becoming more risk averse, then they're switching their focus to investment and struggling maybe to get a handle on how to go about securing that investment. And then we'll talk a bit about boosting customer demand for our products and services overseas. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Empowering SMEs for International Trade programme, because it's that's the programme that is funding these webinars today, but it also consists of a whole host of one-to-one support and peer support for companies that are based in the East Midlands. So that's Lincolnshire, Nottinghamshire, Leicestershire and Derbyshire. But there's also support available for you as a company if you're based outside of those areas, and we'll cover that off towards the end. And then we'll finish off with a general chit chat and questions, really, which would be great to hear your perspectives, get some feedback, and maybe answer some questions that you might have. Okay, so I don't really want to labour too much on this particular slide, but I've just pulled together some stats, really, which kind of aim to illustrate the issue that the sector is facing at the moment. So we saw the greatest or the sharpest fall in activity in terms of British manufacturers since the recession back in 2008. So already manufacturers were starting off on a difficult footing. So they'd seen a sharp fall in orders, and also, having to experience ongoing job cuts, and then also, the other challenges that we've mentioned around obtaining talent for specific roles within their businesses. So there's a whole lot of stats here. I don't want to labour them too much, but it's part of this research and this direct feedback from some of our clients that have kind of helped us shape this webinar today, and why we're focusing on certain elements. Okay, so the first one, downward pressure on prices. So I suppose this is something that we should all be doing, whether or not we're engaged in global trade. So when there is pressure on pricing, then it can often be tempting to embark on a race to the bottom, which is never a good thing to do. So the real thing here is to question whether you are differentiating the value that you deliver, whether you're perceiving the value that you deliver from the customer's perspective, and whether thinking like that gives you the opportunity to differentiate the offering, so that you move the conversation away from cost more to value, more to quality, more to company values, and so on. And obviously, we're seeing the rise of the conscious business customer and the conscious consumer, who are caring more and more about what companies are doing to safeguard the environment and society. So sustainability is another option, another opportunity to differentiate what you do vis-a-vis your competitors, be they UK or overseas. So it's really about thinking, are there any ways that we could shift the conversation from pure cost to one of differential value? The other opportunity there is to consider alternative overseas markets for supply. So when we do have very intricate global supply chains, and China has been over and above our main supplier as a global society for some time now. But actually, China has experienced some staggering wage increases over the last 10 to 15 years, which have seen actually salaries now more or less on a par with some of our Eastern European countries. So you really have to question, if you're sourcing from China, are you really getting the best possible price? The other thing to mention as well is, just as I mentioned at the beginning, China's responsible for some 19% of global supply. So obviously when COVID hit and they were impacted, our supply chains fell over, and to be honest, many of them are still, struggling to recover. So consider alternative markets for supply. So India and Southeast Asia are widely regarded as good alternatives for manufacturing. Also look at more than just cost when you're sourcing overseas suppliers. So, think about what is important to UK regulation and also to your customers. So think about ESG, think about traceability of supply. So, don't just base your decision on a particular supplier on cost exclusively. Map your supply chains for efficiency gains and cost savings. So, by understanding where you're getting product from and where you're shipping to, it can uncover opportunities to switch to other markets where there might be a preferential trade deal in place, or it might uncover opportunities to drop ship as opposed to bringing product into the UK first. It can really be helpful to map your entire supply chain and understand the transport costs, the duties and taxes that are payable, and all of those kind of things. Really think quite objectively about how you're bringing goods into the country. Look to export markets. If you're exporting already, let somebody in. If you're exporting already, then you may already be looking at emerging markets. But if you're not, think about those emerging and developing countries, because they have far greater prospects with regards to disposable income moving forward. So just some of the stats, we've got those emerging countries that might have had a per capita income of under $2,000 in 2005. That had doubled by 2021 and is going to be around about $7,000 by 2040. So when you're thinking about those markets, then think about whether there's ones that are less cost sensitive or price sensitive than, say, those developing economies are, like the EU, the US, and so on. So look at those high growth markets. And also remember that export is a really good way of prolonging product life cycles. So your product might have kind of plateaued in the UK, but might still be very relevant in less developed countries, for example. And always be looking for markets that have preferential trade agreements in place with the UK, because obviously then you're looking at import duties of reduced rates or zero rates. And generally the ability to trade with those markets, a trade agreement typically covers a lot more than just import duties and so on. There's a real easement of trade between those two parties in a bilateral trade agreement. So be familiar with where the UK has managed to either roll over EU trade agreements or has gone out and struck new ones. Okay, I've lost my mouse. So addressing top labour, accessing top labour and talent. So yeah, this is a big one across all sectors. It's not just linked to manufacturing. But I think what we're seeing in the market, especially with the Z generation now, is that attracting talent is almost as challenging as acquiring customers now. So you almost have to adopt the same process. You have to make your company attractive to that talent that you want to recruit. And younger people that are moving into employment now have different requirements of their work. They want to work a 4-day week. They want flexible working. They want to understand that the business that they're joining is aligned to their values. So there are opportunities to really promote your company to those individuals and almost establish an on-demand talent pool that you can tap into as and when they'll be approaching you, rather than the other way around. But there's also the opportunity of hiring non-UK nationals. So we do have the sponsorship scheme in the UK, which obviously got a lot of press post-Brexit. So it is an opportunity, and there are several advantages. When you're recruiting from overseas, you instantly have access to a wider pool of talent. You're increasing the diversity of your company. You're expanding its knowledge base, because if you're persistently hiring from a particular country or region, then you're potentially limiting the knowledge base of your workers. It can boost creativity and innovation. It can enrich the culture of your company, and lots of different advantages. But we do have this sponsorship scheme, and there's lots of information on the gov.uk website. But you do not, I suppose it's important to mention what you don't need a license for, or a sponsor license for. You don't need a sponsor license if you want to recruit Irish citizens, for example, so that's different, or anybody with pre-settled status from before our departure from the EU. And there are two different types of licenses. So there is a worker's license, which is for skilled long-term employees. And then there is a temporary worker's license, which is for, just as the name would suggest, temporary employment. And all companies are eligible so long as they have a UK legal entity, that they're compliant from a UK government perspective. So, they haven't committed any offences or been involved in money laundering or any of that awful stuff, which I'm sure none of you have been. And the job that you're recruiting for must have a suitable rate of pay, and it must have a required skill, and then it must meet the visa requirements of the applicant. But on the whole, that's something that you could consider if in your industry, i.e. manufacturing, that you're kind of not being able to access the right talent. Now, there's always costs involved with these kind of schemes, but they're not bank breaking. So a sponsor license fee, which is renewed every 4 years, that's a one-off fee every 4 years of about £1,500 if you want to recruit permanent workers, or £500 for temp workers, or £1,500 if you want to be an employer of both. And then the other cost is a certificate of sponsorship, which is given to each person that you recruit. And again, not bank breaking. For a permanent worker, it's £200. For a temp worker, it's £20, and that's kind of like a one-off fee. And then there are discounts available for charities and smaller businesses. So that's just one way that looking at talent and labour through a global lens can open up opportunities. Struggling to move on here. Supportive lending. So yeah, this is a reality across all sectors, not just manufacturing, but it is one that our manufacturing clients have cited. And also, you know, there's lots of information in the public domain about it. So obviously in manufacturing, having good working capital and having good cash flow is imperative. But where traditional lending is not available, then you really ought to consider alternative means to boost that working capital and cash flow. So, you know, there's things that are probably already being done, but I'm citing them anyway, of reviewing and renegotiating your terms with creditors and debtors, and what those kind of payment terms are, whether there's any additional credit that you can get from your creditors that, you know, allow for longer debtor days or whatever, so that you're safeguarding that cash within the business. Make sure that you're optimizing tax breaks. So there are tons of reliefs available, from capital allowances on purchases of equipment and machinery, vehicles, and so on. But then there's also other reliefs like R&D relief and credit and so on. There's a whole list which I can provide after this webinar if useful. But then the other thing to mention, which is available to manufacturers, is purchase order finance and invoice finance. So purchase order finance is a type of funding to help you pay your suppliers and help your cash flow. So it works as almost like an advance to you from a finance provider, of which there are a plethora. And that advance is secured against your confirmed purchase order from your customer. Now, there's fees that are payable, but some are really quite reasonable. So they could be anywhere between 1% and 6% of that advance per month, which you might only need it for that month potentially. Invoice finance is kind of similar, but works for invoices. So your lender, of which if you're in export, you'll be familiar with UK Export Finance and BB Financial Services, they will use an unpaid invoice as security to fund you. So essentially you recognise the invoice as if it had been paid almost up front, and then they're responsible for recouping those fees from the customer. That is the case if it's factoring. So there are two types of invoice finance: factoring and invoice discounting. So factoring is where essentially the difference is where the responsibility for recouping those funds from the customer is on the lender's side, so they take responsibility for it. And invoice discounting works in a similar way to factoring, but it's you that recoups the customer payments and then pays the funder. So again, UK Export Finance and BB Financial Services are great providers of this kind of facility, if you like. Sustainability of supply chains. This is cited by a number of our clients. It is and it does concern us somewhat, because most of our clients are SMEs, And a lot of the sustainability legislation that's coming through is pertinent to corporates and doesn't really filter down to SMEs. But as small cogs in large supply chains, it is going to have a dramatic impact, at some point. So we're always really quite buoyed when a client says to us that they want to consider sustainability, because to us it denotes that they're kind of getting ahead of the curve. But it is a concern. So I think, when we're talking to clients, we urge them to consider all aspects of sustainability when sourcing and vetting and appointing suppliers. So quite often we can get wrapped up in the environmental impacts and, ask suppliers to give us their carbon footprint accounting and give us stats of that kind of thing. But actually, the other half of ESG is the social value, and it's just as important that you consider that as well as the environmental. So social aspects of ESG, could be how your supplier deals with health and safety. Are their salary structures fair? Is there workplace diversity and inclusion? Is there good employee well-being? Is a good employee community engagement? So you're really looking at not just their environmental credentials, but what they're doing from a society perspective as well. And what we see a lot of our clients do now is what we call materiality assessments, whereby they look at what they perceive as being what's the word I'm looking for? Obtainable from them as a business. So they look at the structure of their business, the sector that they're in, the kind of processes that they undertake, and they might use the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a framework and think, okay, well, there's 17 of those. There's 3 of them that our company can actually impact, and we can measure our impact. And then they consult their stakeholders, and stakeholders are predominantly their employees, and importantly, their customers as well. Maybe if they've got investors on board, they'd be consulted too. And very quickly, they're able to shape the things that they can do from a company perspective to impact against those things that their stakeholders feel are important. So that's really, really important. And if your supply chain are in the process of doing that as well, that gives you a good feeling that they're getting under the bonnet of sustainability and they're taking it seriously as a business. But also, when you're looking at markets to source from, you want to understand what the in-country regulators are doing as well. So which areas of ESG are they prioritizing? Because if they're not, then if they're not prioritizing what the UK is, or they're not aligned in terms of the UK's regulatory framework and regulation coming down the line, then it may become difficult for you to provide that full traceability and tell that compelling story to your customers and investors and employees and so on about you, basically working ethically, sourcing from companies that are taking sustainability seriously. And then when you know that they are, then the kind of things that you're asking for are their policies on certain things, any kind of metrics that they've got, any kind of documentation from them to demonstrate that they're complying with their local market regulation and that they have the foresight to consider UK market regulation as well. I just wanted to touch also on legislation, because there is a lot of this coming down the line which will impact manufacturers, and I think the integrated nature of our supply chains means that even if legislation doesn't impact us directly, if it impacts a customer or a supplier either in the UK or in the EU, it's going to filter through to us eventually. So I think one of the things to say here is that we need to be aware of global legislation. If you're sourcing from overseas or if you're selling overseas, it's kind of like a given. You have to be aware of what's governing sustainability in those other markets, but particularly the EU when we're planning compliance, because it still impacts the direction of travel for our UK regulation. So that one of the most controversial pieces of legislation to come before Parliament last year was the retained EU law. bill, which is also called the Brexit Freedoms Bill, which, if it's enacted, would see a divergence from EU law on environmental issues and so on and so forth. But it seems to be the kind of message that's coming through from DEFRA and the Environment Secretary is that the default approach will be to take steps to retain all EU-derived law relating to environmental policy. So I can't see the fact that we have to comply with the EU law around the environment and sustainability changing. Hopefully it doesn't, because they're some of the most stringent regulations going, and it's a very important subject. But again, that's just my personal view. But there are some other things coming down the line. So biodiversity net gain is coming into effect in November. That affects construction companies, where they have to achieve biodiversity net gains of at least 10% maintained over 30 years. So again, if you're supplying into that industry, it's about understanding whether or not you're going to be impacted by changes that they're going to have to make to achieve their own compliance. ESG and sustainability reporting, obviously that is gaining traction at the moment. Most of it resides with the corporates, but it will start to filter down to the SME level as well. We've also got extended producer responsibility was one I wanted to mention. So that really places, if you think about it from an exporter's perspective, it places the burden of recycling on the exporter. That's the simplest way of putting it. So it's the notion that producers, and the producer can be the manufacturer or can be the exporter, is responsible for paying the full costs of dealing with the waste their product ultimately becomes at the time when it's placed on the market, right the way through to the end of its life. So the problem here is, if you think about the EU market alone, we've got no EU member state implementing this regulation in the same way. So they've all got their own regulatory bodies and their own bodies responsible for taking payments from UK exporters, for example. And then they've all set different thresholds in terms of when you have to report. So some may set a threshold based on the amount in tonnage that you export, some in the amount per value, and then some EU member states haven't even implemented the regulation yet. So it's a bit of a challenge for manufacturers and exporters to get their head around. But the full scheme is expected to be in place by January 2024, I think it is, which will see all 27 member states adopt it. And you know, what I would urge manufacturers to do now, and exporters, is to start collecting the data now so that they're ready to start reporting for those countries that they export to. The other thing we're going to see is the banning of single-use plastics. That is going to be in place by October 2023. So that's kind of things like single-use plastic plates, trays, bowls, cutlery, all sorts of stuff. It doesn't apply to those items that are used as packaging in self-ready or pre-packaged foods, but when they're sold individually, those kind of products will be banned. We're also seeing, waiting with anticipation to see how the UK is going to regulate chemicals going forward. So whether a dedicated chemicals agency is going to be established. So there's a lot of stuff happening. And then I think finally the one I wanted to mention was this best available practice, best available techniques for environmental permitting of industrial installations. So companies are going to have to follow economically and technically viable techniques that are best for preventing or at least minimizing emissions and impacts on the environment as a whole. So that's when they are going to be implementing certain installations, industrial installations. So we're going to see impacts on the textiles, ferrous metals, and waste gas treatment in some of these industries. So there's an awful lot going on at the moment, and I think the more aware and the more prepared you can be, the better. In terms of increasing costs, which is another one which is cited, and we know that the manufacturing industry is struggling with, obviously it goes without saying, ensure that all opportunities to reduce or eradicate those unnecessary costs are explored. Talking about international trade, make sure that you're recognizing all of those efficiencies in transport. So again, when I went back before about, is there the opportunity to drop ship, for example, or is there the opportunity to buy in greater volume so you can move from air freight to road freight or sea freight, which typically is at a far lower cost. We mentioned already, consider sourcing from alternative overseas markets where maybe salary expectations are not as great, but there isn't an impact on quality. And then looking at the more operational side of customs and so on, look at duty deferment on imports. So most of you, if you're importing, will maybe already be using postponed VAT accounting. I think it's almost like a blanket approach now. It was introduced at the end of the transition period end, and it effectively means that you don't have to pay the VAT to clear the goods at UK customs. Instead, it's offset against your VAT account. The benefit there is that the agent that's clearing the goods for you doesn't have to use their account to clear the goods, which means that they shouldn't charge you a facilities fee for that. Obviously, that's just VAT, but if you incur duty through importing from third countries, then there's a duty deferment account, and the 10k waiver for the duty deferment account is still in place. So you can have a duty deferment account of up to £10,000 without having to get a customs comprehensive guarantee from your bank, which is great for smaller businesses. Also, look at customs special procedures and facilitations to see if there's a way of reducing your admin and also your duty and VAT costs. So there's a whole raft of them, but the one that I would mention would be maybe inward processing, whereby if you're bringing goods into the UK or raw materials into the UK for the purpose of manufacturing an end product, then you can suspend or in some cases eradicate entirely the duty and VAT payable on those raw materials. So for example, if you bring the raw materials in and you produce the finished goods and you subsequently export them outside of the UK, then that duty and VAT never becomes payable. It's written off. Similarly, if you bring those raw materials in and the finished product is released into free circulation in the UK, then the duty and VAT is payable on the finished goods rather than on the raw materials. And in some cases, that might be a cost saving. The other thing I was going to mention as well is multi-currency accounts. So multi-currency accounts allow you to exchange, send and spend money at kind of market leading optimum rates, and you can typically have 30 plus countries, and so it really gives you the ability to hold various currencies and convert them when you want, so that you can take advantage of those exchange rates, because exchange rate volatility is real. We've experienced it pretty much non-stop since the Brexit referendum. So it might also help save the costs or the fees that your regular bank would charge for this. So just explore it, something else to think about. And then also review your product positioning and consider whether there's any elasticity in your pricing. So, when was the last time that you did a pricing review? Are you absorbing all of your inflated costs? Is there an opportunity to offset some of them to your customers? And again, think about that product positioning. Are you differentiating through value? Are you still selling on features and benefits which actually don't really translate to customer acquisition? Customers buy emotionally. They want to know that the product is going to solve their pain, address their challenge, and that you're aligned in terms of what your product can deliver and what they value. Speeding on. Currency volatility, all I really want to say about this is that where you're trading globally, it's really important that you have a really keen understanding of currency volatility. So obviously, when we have a weak pound, it's great for our exports because we're more competitive in our export market. So you could say our exports increase. But where we have a weak pound, our our importers typically struggle. And the reason for that is most exporters will invoice in GBP, and most importers will be invoiced in the supplier's currency unless otherwise negotiated or agreed. There's no real sign of currency volatility or pound volatility disappearing. I found some research from JP Morgan that said that the pound's underperformance is going to continue throughout 2023. So we're seeing a sterling forecast of 1.15 against the dollar by December 2023. So it's kind of here to stay. So we have to really think about, you know, what we can do to mitigate against that. You've got a couple of things you can do. You can identify forecasts for the year ahead. So understand when you're going to need to purchase those essential goods and what your spending is going to be like, and see if you can phase that over certain months and kind of play the exchange rates. You can look into hedging, so forward contracts. So forward contracts allows you to buy or sell a fixed amount of currency at a pre-agreed rate and lock that rate in for sometimes up to 2 years. So that's quite a good option. And market orders, if you don't have a deadline for your money transfer, you could always put in a market order, and that's like a form of currency hedging, but it enables you to identify a specific rate range. And once that's reached, the exchange rate's made, it offers a little bit more flexibility than a forward contract. So there's definitely that to consider. The other thing would be operate overseas accounts, so US dollar account, a euro account in addition to your sterling account. I think the main takeaway is we are not currency specialists, as that might have already come across, but there are a number of them out there. And I would always say that, you know, if this is something that you want to approach as a mechanism of saving cost, then you should definitely seek advice from a professional in that area, because they can advise you accordingly. EU trading barriers, this is still cited as being one of the biggest barriers. There's no doubt we have seen EU-UK trade contract quite significantly both ways, basically. I think there's several things that importers and exporters can do to kind of counter this a little bit. And unfortunately, it all comes down to kind of becoming a bit of an expert in what you're doing in global trade. And there's tons of training, there's tons of specialists, there's tons of free support out there that can help you do it. But I think things that would help alleviate some of the problems we've seen since Brexit are understanding fully your obligations as an importer or exporter of record. That's key. So, you know, understanding that most agents will represent you in a direct capacity, not an indirect capacity. Therefore, the burden of responsibility and accountability resides with you as the importer or the exporter of records. You have to really understand what the requirements are that are placed on you. So you need to understand things like Incoterms. Are you using Incoterms correctly? You know, Incoterms are always a form of negotiation between buyer and seller. You know, is there the opportunity to actually renegotiate those Incoterms for something that would work better for both parties? You really need to become familiar with import and export entries. So that standard, anybody that joined the call last week will, we had a picture of the C88 come up. You really need to understand what data is required on both of those so that you can instruct your agents accordingly. And importantly, you can sanity check or vet check their entries, because you are responsible for the accuracy of those declarations ultimately. So really become familiar with those. Look at the UK trade tariff and also the common external tariff for the EU. That's accessible via the Access to Markets database. Both of those tariffs, so the UK trade tariff for the UK customs territory, the EU common external tariff for the EU customs territory, they both give pretty good guidance on duties and taxes, but also documentary requirements and import and export controls for different commodities. And they're a massively under-consulted resource, both databases. So as an importer or exporter, you know, you need to be consulting those both of those tariffs. Again, like I said, understand the process of importing and exporting the goods. So the border operating model is a pretty hefty document that was produced by government, not last year, the year before, and it's got several different iterations. That lays out processes for standard and non-standard goods. So understand where your goods sit, and then basically it documents the process of the documentary exchange, whether there's any, what happens if there's certification or licensing required, who's involved at which point, whether it be, the intermediary or the importer or the exporter, and the obligations of each. So the border operating model is a really, really good resource. Make sure that you're aware of all of those special procedures that I mentioned earlier. So inward processing is one of them, but there's lots of them. And see whether or not they apply to your business. See whether or not, are you making the most of those, or are you paying duty and VAT unnecessarily? And then again, I keep coming back to this, but try and frame the value of British manufactured goods to EU customers differently. So try and move the dialogue away from that, increased burden and increased cost to other things. Really get to the nuts and bolts of what the product is and why it's important that they source from us, and as opposed to seeking alternative suppliers. I'm nearly done, folks. I've got one more. So obtaining investment for growth. This is another one of my passions, investment readiness. So this is a real pain. We've got two clients at the moment who are in the manufacturing sector that are looking for investment. One is looking for a relatively small amount, so in the angel space, and the other one in the VC space. And it's really a case of understanding what your investors are looking for and what you're looking for from an investor as well. So be clear in your expectations of an investor. Are you looking for somebody who's just going to give you the capital? So it's probably more like a VC. Or are you looking for somebody who's going to come onto your board or into your senior management team and plug gaps in terms of skills and resources and contacts and experience? There are a couple of schemes that HMRC offers, which is SEIS and EIS approval, which basically offers tax breaks to investors for investing in firms of a certain age or maturity. So even if you didn't deliver the return that they were looking for, they've recouped some of their investment via tax breaks anyway. Really important to value your business correctly. It could be massively undervaluing it, and if you're looking to part with equity, then it's really important that you understand what equity you have to part with in order to receive that capital. Understand that investors love de-risked businesses, and global trade is a way of spreading risk. So if the UK economy doesn't go so well, then you've also got clients elsewhere. So global trade is a way of spreading risk, of diversifying, of extending product lifetime value of goods, and flattening seasonality of sales as well. So the investor will look upon all of this as a company that's potentially looking to optimize their return. Be really aware of sustainability regulation and prioritize compliance in that area, because regulation that's coming through in the UK is going to impact the kind of projects that investors can invest in, and similarly the level of due diligence that they have to do on a company that they're giving capital to. And I think also investors have developed a bit of a social conscience throughout COVID. So we are seeing more and more investors wanting to diversify their portfolio slightly and invest in companies that are also, as well as delivering commercial gains, are delivering social or environmental good as well. Solid financial projections are an absolute must, and look for local investment readiness support. So lots of the growth hubs have workshops and specialist advisors that can help you become investment ready. So, look at your business as it is today and make it look the most appealing that it possibly can to an investor, and then help you find those investors and pitch effectively to them. And I think that's pretty much, oh no, it's not. Boosting demand for UK products and services overseas. This is just kind of building on what I said earlier. So, we need to become kind of experts. We need to make it easy to do business with us. And we need to focus on markets that are attractive because they've got UK trade agreements in place. So one of the ones I'm particularly excited about is the CPTPP. Try saying that after a glass of wine, because that opens up markets like we've got Australia, Brunei, Canada. We've already got a trade agreement with Japan also, but Malaysia, Mexico, Peru, New Zealand, Singapore, and Vietnam. So there are a lot of those are emerging markets that have huge potential for UK products and services. So we need to be very much aware of the preferential trading landscape of the UK when we're looking for opportunities to sell our products and services. But make it easy to buy from us. You know, be experts in exporting your product. Take away the burden from your customers. And I've listed ways here that you can actually do that. And then again, seek support. So, you know, the Department of Business and Trade, was DIT, ourselves, Global Trade Department, all the growth hubs, LEPs, local chambers, they're all there providing either free or subsidised support to help you become expert exporters. That really is the last one. I'm just going to focus briefly. If any of you are in the East Midlands, then this gives you a rundown of the Empowering SMEs and International Trade Programme and what is available fully funded. This gives you links to book one-to-ones off the back of today's conversation, gives you eligibility criteria if you're in the East Midlands and you're eligible for this programme. You'll get a copy of these slides. I won't labour on them too much. But even if you're joining the call today and you're outside of the East Midlands, then you know, we love to talk. We love to have conversations. We love to hear about challenges and ambitions for importing and exporting. So we're always willing to have, you know, a one-to-one, and you can book those directly via our website. And then again, book up to the rest of these webinars. There's another 10 coming. Obviously, it's time of your life that you'll never get back. I apologise for that, but hopefully we impart some knowledge and do some good as well. I'm just going to